Alright, so let's ask ourselves the oft repeated question, can you engrave brass with a diode laser? No, of course not, but you can use the laser to remove masking material to do a chemical etch. Alright, so I'm going to show you how to do that. Now to start off with, I have a piece of brass, and I'm going to sand it with some 320 grit sandpaper. My only real goal in doing this is to have a nice smooth surface for good paint adhesion. Now, it doesn't really matter what kind of brass you're trying to do this on, except you want the plates to be reasonably thick. I'm talking like 1.5 to 2 millimeters minimum. Reason being, we are going to be removing material from it, and you don't want to etch all the way through. Now, for anything we don't want to etch, we need to cover, and stuff like packing tape works really well to seal in the brass that we don't want to get the acid onto. For that large square plate, I'm just going to leave the protective film on that it came with. Now, just to be clear, this is for the back sides. For the front sides that are going to get etched, first I'm going to clean the brass with some denatured alcohol, and this is again just to get the best possible paint adhesion that I can. Next, I'm going to spray the brass with some Rust-Oleum Paint Plus primer. It doesn't matter what color you use, and it doesn't matter what brand, so long as you can get a good, thick, even coat. After the paint's fully dried, I'm ready to engrave on the design. I'm going to use a Creality Falcon 2 22 watt to do this, but any diode laser or CO2 laser for that matter will be capable of doing this. So all I'm really using the laser for is burning off the paint in the areas that I want to etch with the acid. The engraver settings almost don't even matter so long as it's enough to remove paint from brass, and that doesn't take very much. After the laser finished doing its thing, this is what the brass looked like. You can see the paint's been removed, but we need to do a little bit more cleaning before we do the acid etch. Just using water didn't work too well, so I'm going to use the denatured alcohol again. The big thing here is you really don't want anything that's going to strip off the paint, because we still need that to be there. So this is pretty clean now, and incidentally, the rough edges you see is actually part of the design. So in addition to the 3 small circles, I also did up this square with 8 different maker's marks that I'm going to cut apart later after the etching. Now I'm going to use hot glue and some scrap wood pieces that I cut to make little standoffs that will suspend the brass in the acid. There's lots of different ways that you could do this. I find that this is just the easiest and most stable way of holding this stuff securely. So we're going to be putting these upside down into the acid with the design sides facing down, and we want to make sure that our standoffs aren't too big that would allow the brass to sit on the bottom of the little plastic tray you see. Alright, so here you can see how the piece of brass is hanging suspended upside down inside that plastic tray. So you can see I've got a gap of about 1/8 of an inch between the brass and the plastic tray. That was maybe a little bit too low. Having it closer to 1/4 of an inch would have been better. But this still did work. Now you could do this in any kind of flat bottom tray, but you want to make sure it's glass or plastic. So we want to make sure we have eye protection and gloves and make sure we keep the acid off our skin. So we're going to be using a 43% solution of ferric chloride. You can buy this on Amazon and it will come to you in the mail. Now I'm doing this on brass today, but this will also work on copper. So after I pour the acid, I like to dip the brass in and then I pull it back out and give it a good wipe down with a brush. I do this because sometimes there will be an air bubble or something like that that sort of adheres to the brass and that will screw up the etch. Now a little bit on the ferric chloride. You definitely want to read all the safety precautions when you get it. Like any chemical, you want to have decent ventilation, keep it out of your eyes, don't drink it, and try not to get it on your skin. If you do get it on your skin, just wash it off as soon as possible, and if you get it on your clothes, it will stain. You can easily neutralize it with baking soda, but try to keep it off any metal that you don't want to destroy. And another thing, you can reuse the ferric chloride in more than one etch. Just as a heads up though, the more you use it, the less potent it's going to be. The acidy ions are going to get all used up and it'll take longer and longer to etch until eventually it's just not going to really work anymore. This is another reason why we want to mask all the brass that we do not want to etch, because it will just waste the potency of the ferric chloride. So there are some things you can do to kind of speed up the process, like having it in a warm place or some kind of vibration or agitation to the ferric chloride to keep it moving around. I tend to just let it sit and be patient. After an hour though, I did take a look to see how quickly it was going. I wanted to make sure that the etchings were going to be deep enough so later on I could fill them with paint and then sand the entire brass part smooth. I ended up soaking the brass for a total of 3 hours, but 4 would have been okay as well. The longer you go though, the more definition you can start to lose in your engraving. My designs are pretty basic, but with acid etching you can get a fairly detailed image to come through. Once I was satisfied with the depth of the etch though, I moved everything into this plastic bucket and then I poured the remaining ferric chloride into a plastic container for reuse later. Everything was thoroughly washed off with a hose. If you're especially concerned about the acid, this would also be a good time to neutralize it with baking soda. All the contaminated pieces of wood and the masking material from the backs of the brass was discarded in the trash. So here you can kind of get an idea of how deep the acid was able to etch the brass. Now I'm going to remove all the remaining paint, and to do that I'm just using some lacquer thinner. I'm going to paint the etched portions, but first I'm going to cut that square of 8 into smaller pieces. Brass is soft enough to be able to cut up with woodworking tools, but I happen to have a metal bandsaw, so that's what I'm going to use. But I'm just going to use a normal belt sander to square up the edges. Once I had them all cut out and squared up, I sprayed them again with some paint. If this looks like it's going on a little sloppy, it's because the can was just about out. Once that paint had fully dried, it was time to remove the excess so I could see the shiny brass underneath. Now, when I go to sand that paint off, I want to make sure the brass is really well supported, and to do that I'm going to attach it to a little wood block. So I put some masking tape on each side, and then I glue the two of them together. And the reason I do this way is so that I don't accidentally apply too much pressure in one spot on my engraving and possibly sand through into the etch. So I started off with some 150 grit sandpaper, and I went that low just to get the paint off as quickly as possible without clogging up the sandpaper. Next I went to 320, and after that I went to 800 just to shine up the brass. You could really go as high as you wanted to try and get a mirror finish. Now you definitely want to make sure that that paint is fully dry, otherwise the brass dust that's coming off and filling the etch right now will stick to the paint and it'll kind of ruin the entire process. Once you're happy with the shine, you can just use some water on a paper towel and give it a little bit of a scrub to remove all that excess brass dust. So at this point I was pretty satisfied with what I had, so I carefully removed the brass from the wood. So I repeated this with the other 7 rectangles and the 3 round discs. Now I could have kept going and gotten them as shiny as possible, but I was happy enough with how they looked. Brass does tarnish, so I decided to hit them with some clear coat to delay that as long as possible. So there you have it. That's how easy it is to use a diode laser to transfer your designs onto brass and get an actual permanent engraving. I hope that this video was useful to you, and as always, thanks for watching.